What's the big deal about Bitcoin anyway? What is Bitcoin? Well, fundamentally, Bitcoin is a global peer-to-peer network that's used for transferring payments and storing value. And the most important aspect of that network is that it requires no trust from any of the participants. What does that actually mean? Why is that such a big deal? Let's get into it. What is Bitcoin? So, Bitcoin, from one perspective, is an idea. The idea that Satoshi Nakamoto, an anonymous writer and software developer, or maybe a group of people, we have no idea, proposed one day in August 2008. Bitcoin is also the software that Satoshi introduced and that hundreds of people have improved over many tens of thousands of commits. But besides the actual code, Bitcoin is a global network that's used to transmit payments and store value around the world. And you can have a very cheap computer store the full data set of every transaction that's ever been made on that network. Why is that such a big deal? Well, you have to look at the reason that Satoshi created Bitcoin. And he was quite explicit in the Genesis block of Bitcoin that it was a response to the 2008 financial crisis and the government's monetary policy in the course of that event. And the basic problem that Satoshi is trying to solve is the devaluation of money. So this is the Weimar Deutschmark that was inflated to oblivion. And that's part of the basic problem that Satoshi is trying to solve, to create a sound money that cannot be manipulated by any centralized institution. But the bigger issue is the effect that unsound money, that fiat money, has on the world, and the continuous cycle of process of business cycles, of which 2008 was just the latest, is something that is enabled by government manipulation of monetary policy. But maybe an even bigger problem is the wars that it causes. So the First World War was made possible because central banks could now suddenly print all the money they needed to commit the entire economy to a state of total war. Before that, governments had to raise taxes, and because they had to pay for goods in a gold-backed currency, they could not simply redirect the entire economy to war or to whatever cause. But once they had a fiat money supply, they could arbitrarily print new money and use that money to fund whatever resources, whatever ventures the politicians wanted. And they've been doing it for the last 120 years. So we've seen that with the dollar losing 96% of its value since the central bank was created in 1913. And we also saw the negative effects of the inflation on society. So websites like WTF happened in 1971 have tracked how basically social progress has stagnated once or that accelerated when the US finally fully went off the gold standard in 1971. Why is that? I think the fundamental explanation is that all social progress or all economic progress depends on savings. If you consume everything you produce, you have no resources remaining to create a better tomorrow. In order to invest in the future, in order to build factories and bridges and invent new technologies, you must save some of what you produce and invest in the future. So savings is required to improve the human condition. But with a fiat money supply, where the government can arbitrarily print money, there's just too much temptation for politicians to take that saving and spend it now on politically favorable causes, on causes that will satisfy their electorate. And there's nothing to stop politicians from just printing money. And what we've seen is that the savings rates of the world have collapsed with the change to fiat monetary system, because politicians are able to print new money and use that new money to basically pillage the public savings. And so that's why we've had interest rates on deposit accounts go to nothing, because our savings net can complete with government spending. And so we need to have a sound money that politicians cannot touch in order to save money to create a better future for ourselves individually and for society as a whole. So Bitcoin is an attempt to solve that problem. And of course, throughout history, we've had many kinds of money. Before we had fiat money in dollars and other currencies, we had gold. Before that, value was stored in cattle and shells and many other mediums. But the idea of Bitcoin evolved over a few decades, and basically several different projects, whether in a white paper or in a proof of concept, introduced the basic concepts behind Bitcoin. But it was Satoshi Nakamoto, whomever that actually is, that in 2008 basically created a working version of all these concepts and introduced the concepts of the blockchain and the difficulty adjustments. So let's get into that. How does Bitcoin actually work? So the core of Bitcoin is the Bitcoin mining. So for every other kinds of money in history, when the demand for that money goes up, when the value of that money goes up, the supply can go up as well. So if gold becomes a lot more valuable, we can mine more gold. Bitcoin is unique in that the supply of Bitcoin is completely independent from the demand. So how does that work? Well, miners, and this is my mining rig on the left right here, mine Bitcoin to create new Bitcoin. But the amount of Bitcoin they mine is constant. It's determined by code. And basically the way it works is every 2 weeks, the difficulty to create the Bitcoin adjusts to match the supply. And so the supply of Bitcoin is controlled by a formula where there will only ever be 21 million Bitcoin sometime after year 2100, and the supply gradually decreases every 4 years. It's halved every 4 years, so that at this point, nearly 90% of all Bitcoin that will ever exist has already been mined. And so this is a chart of how the network automatically adjusts the difficulty of mining to keep the supply constant. So you see in 2020, China banned Bitcoin, and the supply of Bitcoin, the hash rate dropped almost in half, and the difficulty automatically dropped as well to keep the supply of Bitcoin constant. And then the miners set up camp in the US and in Mongolia, and so the supply recovered. So that is how the supply of Bitcoin remains constant, and that's what makes it a hard or a sound money supply. So I think the future, what is the future of Bitcoin, is that it doesn't necessarily have to compete with the dollar. I think it's most useful for the unbanked, the people that currently don't have access to sound money or bank accounts. Now they can have a bank in their pocket that nobody can regulate or take away. There's many countries that have very high inflation rates where the poor don't have access to the banking system. And I think that's the main opportunity for Bitcoin today. I think eventually it can become a global store of value, a global Fort Knox for even for governments to use, instead of right now, basically we have an international barter system where central banks have to store the currencies of a bunch of other governments. So Bitcoin can become a universal store of value, just as gold once was. And so I think we'll see Bitcoin start off providing banking services to the unbanked, but ultimately it does not have to be the way you buy coffee. It can become a global store of value, and it can displace a lot of other assets that are currently used as a very inefficient store of value, real estate and bonds and and gold and many other things that really we only buy because we cannot trust the fiat currency to preserve its value. And so I think Satoshi had this vision that what we are saving is the ability of people to save for a better future. And so the dystopia is one in which the state has total control over the economy. And we've seen from the history of the 20th century that never works out really well. The goal is for people to be able to save individually and be able to invest their labor to create a better future for themselves. So now let's talk about Bitcoin as an investment. So of course it's performed very well, but let's analyze why the price has gone up so much. And I think the basic reason is the network effect. So Metcalfe's law says that the value of a system of a network increases as the number of participants increases. And why is that? Obviously, when Bitcoin was only in Satoshi's computer, that was the sole node, it was not very valuable because no one else accepted that as money. But the more participants were in that network, the more valuable the network becomes. So we can see that as the number of participants increases, so does the value of the network, so does the price. And so we've seen that Bitcoin is the best performing asset over the last decade by far. There's not even any comparison. But also, more importantly, it's a very consistent rate of growth that it's averaged. There's been a few off years, but it's averaged basically tripling in value every year. And so there's an interesting website, bitcoinprogressbar.com, that looks at the potential of Bitcoin and looks at the assets that it's competing with. So it's competing as a store of value with gold, right? So if it replaces investment gold, what's the price of Bitcoin? It would be 140,000. What if it replaces all the world's narrow money? The price of Bitcoin would be 2.2 million. What if it replaces all the things people use as a store of value right now? Then the price would be 5 million. So that's not a prediction, but it's just to make you think about how the price of Bitcoin is determined by the role that it would have in society. So how do you get started with Bitcoin? Well, you just go to a Bitcoin exchange and you buy some. But more importantly, the question is, how do you store the Bitcoin? So once you buy the Bitcoin, I certainly recommend that you get a hardware wallet like one of these. So it's a device like a mini computer that stores the keys for your Bitcoin. And because it's a very simple computer that has a very simple in-out interface, it's very hard to hack. It has no Wi-Fi. It's just a very simple interface for storing your Bitcoin and signing transactions. And the way that you back it up is on a list of 12 words, which is a seed phrase that generates your Bitcoin keys. And in case your house burns down, you can put that on a metal plate that you buy and slip the letters into, and you store that in a safe. And you can leave, anybody can recover your Bitcoin from that seed phrase list. So you can leave that as a legacy to your heirs. Okay, I hope you've enjoyed this explanation of Bitcoin 101. Let me know if you have questions. Please like this video if you found it useful.